90s basketball, lanky forward, last name Grant, and goggles? That's gotta be Horace, right? Close, but not quite. That's Harvey Grant, Horace's lesser-known twin brother. While Horace Grant was winning championships, Harvey was in Washington, spending his early years on some bad Bullets teams as one of their best young pieces, and arguably a better scorer than his brother, with one of the most automatic mid-range shots in the league. But bridges were burned, and Grant was traded to Portland, where he seemed to lose his touch, while also dealing with one of the worst injuries a shooter can have, leading to a gradual career decline. But Harvey Grant had great college success and was a more than respectable NBA player. And even if he wasn't the all-around player his brother was, maybe he'd be better remembered if he too was drafted into a great situation. But
I guess we'll never know.
Let's jog your memory. Harvey Grant grew up in Georgia as the minutes younger brother of his identical twin Horace, and the two would attend Hancock Central High School, where they would both star, where as a senior, Harvey would average a double-double, while helping the team to the region title. But with Harvey breaking his wrist during the season, he lost out on some possible recruiting attention. However, he and Horace had always considered themselves a package deal, and when a program like Clemson came calling, the two would commit. But Harvey was realistic, and didn't expect for him or Horace to get much playing time as a freshman. And Harvey was kind of right about Horace, as the older Grant occupied mostly a bench role for the team, but would get respectable minutes as the season went on. But Harvey watched all of this from the sidelines, as he was redshirted as a freshman, not making his debut for the team until the following season. But now the coach who had signed him, in Bill Foster, was gone, and under new coach Cliff Ellis, Grant wouldn't receive the playing time in '85 that he may have been expecting, and would even be suspended by Ellis for academic reasons before the season started. So while Grant did appear in nearly every game, he was in a limited bench role, while Horace was becoming a star. But Harvey still put up some good rebounding numbers for a Tigers team who went 16-13, but would lose their first NIT game, with Grant's first season seeing him average about 5 points, 4.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game. But it didn't look like Grant would crack the starting lineup next year, so he would take a different route. Shortly after the season wrapped up, it was announced that Grant would be transferring, and to avoid losing eligibility, he would take the JUCO route and enroll at Independence Community College in Kansas, as he would star for the Pirates, averaging about 22.5 points and 12 rebounds, and would show an improved shooting touch over the season, as he was set to return to D1 basketball come the '87 season, first committing to Kentucky. But it turned out he was signing a lot of scholarships, reportedly also committing to Georgia State and Nevada at one point. But by late August, he was enrolled at the University of Oklahoma. But almost immediately after his signing, he dealt with more wrist issues, as he broke the wrist on his shooting hand. But he was good to go come the beginning of the season, and under head coach Billy Tubbs, Grant was definitely getting more playing time as a day one starter, and he was in a better winning situation than he was at Clemson, as the Sooners had one of the most powerful offenses in the nation, with the high-scoring wing duo of Tim McAllister and Daryl Kennedy. But Grant got his points too, as the team's second leading scorer, while leading the Big Eight in rebounds. As while he played down low, he was also agile and could easily get out in transition and outrun teams, as the Sooners often did, winning 7 of their first 8, then soon after going on a 10-game win streak. And during this time, the Sooners pulled off one of the biggest upsets in program history, when they handed top-ranked UNLV their only regular season loss of the year, as Grant led the way, with 23 points and 16 rebounds. They would stumble to end the regular season, winning just 2 of their final 7, but they got back on track with a win over Iowa State in the conference tourney quarterfinals, with Grant scoring 25 in the game, before falling to Kansas in the semis. But at 22-9, the Sooners got an NCAA tournament bid and would take on Tulsa in round 1, with Grant recording 21 points and 17 rebounds, as Oklahoma pulled away down the stretch and were advancing to a second-round matchup with Pitt, and Grant would finish with 18 points and 8 rebounds, in what ended up being another close Sooners win. But they moved on to the Sweet 16 to take on Iowa, and while Grant had 15 points and 3 blocks, This time, Oklahoma was on the wrong end of a close score, as their season ended with Grant averaging about 17 points, 10 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But with guys like Kennedy and McAllister graduating, Oklahoma wasn't projected to make too much noise in '88, but they had other ideas. So while they had lost some top players, they still had Grant, along with senior point guard Ricky Grace, and big man Stacey King would break out as a junior. Then they also had another JUCO transfer, whose defense triggered a lot of fast breaks, in guard Mookie Blaylock, as the Sooners' offense this year made last year's look pedestrian. Grant would up his scoring to over 20 points per game and still be one of the conference's top rebounders, en route to a first-team all-conference selection. And Oklahoma looked unstoppable to begin the season. They would win their first 14, and during that win streak would score below 90 points once and above 140 points 3 times. Then after a couple losses, they would win another 12 in a row, as they would finish the regular season at 27-3, while capturing the Big 8 regular season championship at 12-2. Then they would run through Colorado in the conference tourney quarterfinals before some closer wins over Missouri and Kansas State, as they would take home the tournament title and get an automatic bid to the NCAA tournament. Grant kicked off the big dance with a great performance in a rout of Tennessee-Chattanooga, scoring 25 points on 9 of 12 shooting. Round 2 would be a step back with just 8 points versus Auburn, but Oklahoma still made it out with a relatively easy win. The Sweet 16 versus Louisville would be Grant's best, with a game-high 34 points along with 4 steals, in another win, as they moved on to an Elite 8 matchup with Villanova. And this game would see Grant finish with a solid 12 points and 9 boards, with a huge second half pushing Oklahoma through, as they were 1 game away from a national championship appearance. And in their closest game up to that point, Grant stepped up with 21 points and 10 rebounds, as Oklahoma outlasted Arizona, and it was an all Big 8 national championship, with Oklahoma taking on Kansas. But the Sooners ran into Danny and the Miracles, as although Grant had 14 points, he also got into foul trouble, and the depth of Kansas, as well as the play of their star, was enough to hold off Oklahoma, as the Sooners came up just short, with Grant's senior season seeing him average about 21 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. And while his path hadn't been the same, Harvey was about to become the second Grant to make the NBA, after Horace had been a top pick last year. After a stellar college career at Oklahoma, Harvey Grant entered the 1988 NBA draft, where he was a first-round pick, 12th overall by the Washington Bullets. But there was a small hope the Chicago Bulls would draft him, to reunite him with his brother Horace, who they had picked 10th overall last year, as the Bulls possessed the 11th pick in this year's draft. But with Chicago in need of a center, they took Will Perdue, leaving Harvey Grant to join a Washington Bullets team that didn't look like they would contend anytime soon. And while he was still just Horace Grant's brother, Harvey knew he was ready for the NBA, and now it was time to show it. So the 6'8" Grant was a bit of a tweener, as while he had played more down low in college, he had the build and mobility more suited for a small forward, but he had showed improvement in his shooting throughout college, so it looked like he could be a future piece who could replace the Bullets' aging star Bernard King. And he showed he wasn't going to be intimidated, even by the league's biggest stars. But overall, Grant would spend his rookie year as a backup forward, yet would be productive in his limited minutes, even scoring 9 points against his brother's Chicago Bulls in his first ever NBA game. But outside of King and high-scoring guard Jeff Malone, the Bullets were a relatively average offensive team, and they weren't much different on defense. And when you're middle of the pack on both sides of the ball, your record tends to reflect that, as they finished at 40-42 and missed the playoffs, with Grant's rookie year ending with him averaging about 5.5 points, 2.5 rebounds, and an assist per game. While Washington looked the same going to the 1990 season, they were dealt a big blow about a month into the year, as John Hotplate Williams suffered a season-ending knee injury, as the Bullets not only lost one of their best players, but now had less front-court depth. And while they still had King and Malone doing their usual offensive damage, the loss of Williams hurt their defense as well. So the injury would lead to Grant getting 25 starts on the year, and seeing a big jump in his minutes. And offensively, he showed great improvement, but he wasn't quite the defender his brother was, and was playing on a team who didn't have a lot of great defenders. So Washington would see their defense drop to one of the worst in the league, as the team would fail to improve on last year, going just 31-51, as Grant's second season had seen him average about 8 points, 4 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But Grant would get his opportunity the following season, and he made sure not to waste it. Over the offseason, the Bullets would add a much-needed big man when they traded for Pervis Ellison, but Jeff Malone was part of the trade, so Washington had lost one of their best scorers. And with the rest of Williams' time in Washington being plagued by injuries and weight issues, they needed someone to step up, and that someone would be Grant. While Bernard King had one of the greatest seasons of his career, Harvey Grant would become a full-time starter and break out in year 3, acting as the team's second leading scorer and rebounder on the most efficient shooting season of his career, taking a bit of the pressure off of King. Yet while the addition of Pervis Ellison helped Washington's interior defense, the loss of Malone hurt their offense. So while they were allowing less points, they were also scoring less, and mediocre seasons in Washington were becoming the usual, as they would fall 1 win short of matching last season's total, finishing at 30-52, and once again missing the playoffs, with Grant's breakout year seeing him average about 18 points, 7 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But while Grant remained a starter in 92, he would again see a role change for the Bullets. While Horace Grant was clearly best suited for power forward, it was beginning to feel like Harvey was being forced into that same role. But when injuries led to Bernard King missing the entire 92 season, Harvey Grant became the team's starting small forward and was able to show more of his ability off the dribble, along with the outside shooting that he had shown throughout his time at Oklahoma, something he had fallen in love with and been working on since high school. And for the second straight season, Grant would average at least 18 points and would form a scoring trio with the league's most improved player in Ellison and their big offseason acquisition in point guard Michael Adams, as Grant was the team's third leading scorer and second best rebounder. But the Bullets just continued to go backwards, as their good collection of individual talent didn't really translate into a cohesive team, with this year seeing them win just 25 games and end yet another season without a playoff berth, as Grant's year wrapped up with him averaging about 18 points, 7 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But it looked like Grant's fortunes were about to change heading into free agency, but it didn't go as planned. After improving every year since entering the NBA in 1988, Harvey Grant was $17 million richer going into the 93 season, after the Washington Bullets had re-signed him to a 6-year extension. But it could have been a lot different for Grant, as he was a restricted free agent in the summer of 92 and had met with the New York Knicks, who offered him the same contract. But Washington, who a year earlier had been reluctant to even discuss an extension, would accuse New York of tampering, then seemingly out of spite, would match New York's offer, as Grant missed out on an opportunity to play for a contender, and the Knicks missed out on a versatile young player who could have taken some of the scoring load off of Patrick Ewing, instead signing Tony Campbell as their backup plan. And even though Grant got his money, he didn't get his wish to be a New York Knick. And more importantly, he had lost an opportunity to take on his brother in a future playoff series. So an unhappy Grant was still a Washington Bullet, but the team just continued going in the wrong direction, as while they had brought in a top rookie forward in Tom Gugliotta, Pervis Ellison missed nearly half the season, and the Bullets were one of the league's worst teams on both sides of the ball. Yet even though he wasn't where he wanted to be, Grant was living up to his contract, as this season would see him lead the team in scoring for the first time in his career, on a career-high average, as he recorded 7 double-doubles on the season and had 4 games with at least 34 points, including his career high of 41 in a December 19th loss to Charlotte, as at least he could always say that he scored more in a single game than his brother ever did. But at this point, the Bullets were an NBA cellar dweller, sitting near the bottom of the standings all season and finishing with the league's worst record at 22-60, as Grant's year had ended with him averaging about 18.5 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. But after seemingly signing Grant out of spite, the Bullets would trade him away only a year later. In late June, Washington traded away their unhappy player to Portland and received the Blazers' disgruntled big man Kevin Duckworth, as Grant had a clause in his contract that allowed him to become an unrestricted free agent next season, and Washington knew he'd exercise it, so they tried to get something for him. And while it wasn't the New York Knicks, Grant was clearly glad and a little nervous to be joining a team who had actually been winning games over the past few years. Harvey Grant was now a Portland Trailblazer, but this was a much deeper team than in Washington. As while Grant remained a starter, he got about 10 less minutes than he had gotten in '93, and a lot less shots, as he was playing with guys like Clyde Drexler and Cliff Robinson. So Grant didn't have the ball in his hands nearly as much as before, and he also was deferring a lot to begin the season, seeming unsure about his role on a more established team. But he would somewhat rediscover his shot as the year went on, and still gave head coach Rick Adelman some freedom with his lineups, due to Grant's versatility. And Portland also played fast and scored a lot in transition, and that was right up Grant's alley. So he would still manage double-figure scoring for the season. But these weren't the same Blazers of the early 90s, and while they weren't bad, they no longer looked like a championship contender. But they were still going to try, as their 47-35 record would get them a first-round matchup with the Houston Rockets, as Grant was making his first ever playoff appearance. But Grant had been struggling to end the season, and after an 8-point performance in a Game 1 loss, Adelman would bring Grant off the bench for the rest of the series, and he responded in a big way, scoring 14 points on 7 of 12 shooting in Game 2, then 12 points on 6 of 8 shooting in Game 3, as the Blazers staved off elimination with a Game 3 win. But Grant played just 6 minutes in a Game 4 loss, which ended Portland's season, as Grant's first year in Portland had seen him average about 10.5 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. So the Grant acquisition hadn't gone as planned in year 1, and the media wasn't holding back with their frustrations towards the Blazers and Grant, with some even wanting him to use his opt-out clause. But it no longer existed, as the Blazers had removed it from his contract during last season out of fear that they would lose him. But Grant had showed some signs of life in coming off the bench in the playoffs. So that's where new head coach PJ Carlesimo would keep him this season, while also playing him all over, as he spent time at power forward and even played some guard. And Grant was giving the Blazers some good production in his new role, but his minutes were confusingly inconsistent, and the Blazers confirmed the closing of their championship window when they traded away Clyde Drexler at the deadline. And while Portland's offense took a hit, they had also improved on the defensive side of the ball, and would turn in a similar record to last year at 44-38, which got them back into the playoffs to take on the Suns. And Grant had ended the season hot, so he tried to keep that going in this series, as he would average over 14 points and 5 rebounds on 50% shooting, including a 21-point Game 2. But the Suns dismissed the Blazers with a convincing sweep, as Grant's season had ended with him averaging about 9 points, 4 rebounds, and an assist per game. So it had been 2 underwhelming seasons in Portland for Harvey Grant, but the normally knockdown shooter had been playing with wrist issues for almost all of his time there, as he had injured his wrist early during his first season with Portland, and had undergone significant wrist surgery prior to last season. And as this was his shooting wrist, it was going to hinder his game. But come the following season, Grant would be back in the starting lineup, and would be taking on a new leadership role, as well as improve his scoring slightly from last year, and have his best rebounding season since he arrived in Portland. And he had also extended his range, as after taking 75 three-pointers over his first 7 seasons, he took 67 this season alone, and made more than his first 7 years combined. But at this point, the Blazers were stuck in no man's land. They were good enough to play above 500 and make playoff appearances, but they weren't a legitimate threat to contend, as this season would be another 44-38 record and first-round matchup with Utah. And while they would push this series the distance, Grant had the worst playoff series of his career up to that point, putting up about 5.5 points on 34% shooting and not rebounding as much as you'd like, as ultimately Utah won, with Grant's season ending with him averaging about 9.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But this marked the end of Harvey Grant's underwhelming stint in Portland. After being in trade rumors throughout his entire time in Portland, Harvey Grant was finally included in an offseason trade, which sent him back to Washington, as he and Rod Strickland joined a Bullets team now led by the young forward duo of Chris Webber and Juwan Howard. This season would see Grant continue as a bench player, And interestingly, he would start rocking his own pair of goggles, just like the ones that had become the trademark of his brother. And while I couldn't find a definitive reason why, maybe Harvey was beginning to suffer from myopia, the same condition that forced Horace to start wearing them in the early 90s. But regardless, Harvey still gave the Bullets some forward depth that they desperately needed, and even started 25 games this season. But the Bullets also went through 3 coaches this year, yet were still able to manage a winning record at 44-38, which would get them a first-round matchup with Chicago. But Grant would barely see the court in this series, as Chicago made quick work of Washington with a sweep, with Grant's return to Washington seeing him average about 4 points, 3.5 rebounds, and an assist per game. By the following season, Washington was now the Wizards, but Grant had been pushed down further in the rotation, as the now 10-year pro was only getting about 14 minutes per game. But he was still a good player to have, with Weber and Howard each missing some time due to injury, and Washington would have a season a lot like last year, finishing at 42-40, but it wouldn't be enough for the playoffs, as Grant's year ended with him averaging about 2.5 points, 2.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game. But now Grant was a free agent, and would sign with the Philadelphia 76ers for the lockout-shortened 99 season. And while he would see a slight uptick in his minutes, overall it was a depth signing for Philly, with a young Allen Iverson-led Sixers team finishing the season at 28-22, and defeating Horace Grant's Orlando Magic in round 1 of the playoffs, before losing to Indiana in round 2, with Grant appearing briefly in 4 of Philly's 8 postseason games. And for the season, Grant would average about 3 points, 2.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game. Over the offseason, Grant would be traded to Orlando, but he would never suit up for the team, as his time in Philly marked the end of his NBA career. And while he didn't have the level of success as his brother, he still played over 10 years in the NBA, and now has gotten to see the Grant name live on in the NBA and overseas, as 3 of his children have played professionally. So while Horace Grant is overlooked in his own right, some don't even know about Harvey Grant. Harvey's game was different from his brother's, and so was his situation, as he didn't get the blessing of playing on elite teams from the moment he entered the NBA. And when he eventually got on a respectable roster in Portland, he seemed to lose some confidence, but was also constantly in trade rumors and dealt with wrist problems that hindered his greatest strength, which was his mid-range shooting. And no, he wasn't a superstar, but he was a legitimate scorer in his early years, and played over a decade in the NBA, while making great money and walking away healthy. And as he was often in his brother's shadow, he deserves to have the spotlight shine on him every once in a while. But that's it for today's episode on Harvey Grant. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on his brother, or this one on one of his Oklahoma teammates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.